Now let's continue with the topic access specifiers. Now in today's presentation I will explain you the concept of access specifiers with the help of a C++ program. Now here is the C++ program that I am going to explain it to you. This program is not mentioned inside your book, but I have included it here. This is because the concept of the protected access specifier has only been mentioned in chapter number 6, which is inheritance. But before I cover the chapter number 6, which is inheritance, you should at least know the basic concept of this protected access specifier. Now look at this chart. This chart is very important. If you want, you can even note it down in your copy. If you look at these members, we have public members, private members, as well as the protected members. If the members are public, then they are accessible everywhere. They are accessible inside the class as well as outside of the class. But if the members are declared as private, they can be accessed only inside the class. They cannot be accessed outside of the class. And if the members are declared as protected, then also they can be accessed only inside the class. They cannot be accessed outside of the class. However, there is one exception to the rule. If the class has some descendants, or you can say if the class has some subclasses or child classes, those subclasses or child classes is going to inherit some properties of that class, and if it inherits or acquires the properties of that class, then those subclasses or the child classes, or you can say the descendants, they can also access these protected members. In detail I am going to explain it to you in chapter number 6 called inheritance. So to just wind it up, the protected members in a class are similar to the private members, as they cannot be accessed from outside the class because they can be accessed only from within the class. But they can also be accessed by the class's descendants or its subclasses or child classes, while the private members cannot. Now take the case of this example. Here the class animals is known as the parent class, whereas the classes dogs and cats are known as the child classes, because these classes dogs and cats are inheriting the properties from the parent class animals. That's why they are also known as the descendants of the parent class called animals. Now if you consider this particular class known as animals, and if this class has both private and the protected members, then the private members belonging to this parent class animals cannot be accessed outside of this class. That means they cannot be accessed by its descendants dogs and cats, as well as they cannot be accessed by any element that is present outside of this class known as animals. However, if this particular parent class animals consist of protected data members, then those protected members of this particular class called animals can also be not accessed by any element that is present outside of this class called animals. So as the members of this class animals, if they are declared as protected, they cannot be accessed by any element that is present outside of this class called animals. However, there is one exception to this rule. If you look at this figure, this particular class called animals has its child classes or descendants, or you can say its subclasses, which are dogs and cats. Since these are the descendants of these parent class animals, So these descendant classes can easily access the protected members of this class called animals. So just remember that for this class called animals, if it has private data members, they cannot be accessed from outside of this class. But if the same class called animals consists of protected data members like these protected data members, then also they cannot be accessed from any element that is present outside of this class called animals. However, there is one exception to the rule. That exception is that since this class animals has descendants known as dogs and cats, these descendant elements or the classes dogs and cats can easily access those protected data members. So we can easily conclude from here that the private data members for the class animals cannot be accessed by its descendants known as dogs and cats. However, the protected data members for the class known as animals can be easily accessed by its descendants known as dogs and cats. So that's the difference between the private and the private and the protected access specifiers. Now let me explain you this program logic. So the program logic is shown here. A class defined by the name employee has been shown here. Its function body as it shouldn't be function body, its body part as represented by the opening parenthesis and the closing parenthesis followed by the semicolon consists of the data members such as EMP code, EMP name, which are private, gender, which is public, and address, which is protected. It also consists of the member functions input code name, which is private, input details, which is public, and input address, which is protected. And if you look at these member functions, its function body is also shown here, and it has been shown here like this as represented by the opening and the closing parenthesis. This time the member functions are not at all showing any abstraction because they are not hiding their implementation details. They are showing their implementation details inside their class called employee. Even for this member function input details, they are showing its implementation part. And again for this member function input address, their implementation part is also visible. So from here we can say that each of these member function, instead of hiding their implementation part, they are showing or disclosing their implementation part. As a result, we cannot see the property of abstraction being implemented by these member function. As a result, each of these member functions input code name, input details, and input address are not showing the property of abstraction. Now let me start this program from the main function. Since the program execution starts from the main function, so I shall start from here and then enter inside the body. The first statement inside the body of this main function is employee space EMP. If you look here, employee is the class name as already defined here. And then with the help of this class known as employee, an object bearing the name EMP has been created. Now as soon as this object EMP gets created out of this class known as employee, the data members and the member functions inside this class called employee shall be wrapped up together, or you can say it shall be bundled together into a single unit. So each of these data members, EMP code, EMP name, gender, address, followed by the member functions, input code name, input details, and input address, they shall be bundled into a single unit. And then it is going to be tied into this object known as EMP. Okay, so each of these data members and member functions shall be wrapped or bundled into a single unit, and then it's going to be tied together into this object known as EMP, and this process is known as encapsulation, or we can say we are creating a capsule, or we can say we are encapsulating this object known as EMP. So when there is encapsulation, these member functions shall operate on the data members. Those are highlighted here. And once the data members and the member functions are tied into this object EMP and the encapsulation process has been done, then in the next step, with the help of the same object EMP using the dot operator, I am trying to access the data member EMP code. But when I try to do so, the compiler has generated an error, and it has generated the error because the data member EMP code has been declared as private, and that you can see it clearly over here. The data member EMP code has been declared as private. Now, as private members cannot be accessed outside of this class called employee, so since this class employee ends here with the help of this semicolon, and I'm trying to access this data member EMP code from inside the main function which is present outside of this class employee. That's why on trying to access this data member EMP code, the compiler shows an error message. Then come over here, look at this statement. In this statement, again with the help of the same object EMP, I was trying to access the data member EMP name. Now when I try to do so, again the compiler has generated an error message. This is because the data member EMP name is also private. Okay, you can see it clearly here, the data member EMP name has been declared as private. Now as private members cannot be accessed outside of this class employee, and since the main function is outside of the class employee, so when I try to access this data member EMP name using the object EMP, the compiler has generated an error message. Then come over here, in this statement using the same object EMP, I am trying to access the data member gender. Now when I try to do so, the compiler did not generate any error. This is because the data member gender has been declared as public. If you come over here, you can see clearly that the data member gender has been declared as public. Now since public data members can be easily accessed from outside of this class known as employee, so if I try to access this data member known as gender from the main function that is present outside of the class employee, it can easily do so, and the compiler will not generate any error message, so no error. So this statement does not show any error. And once with the help of this object EMP, since it is able to access the data member gender, the next step what it does is it assigns the value m to this data member gender. It assigns the value m to this data member gender. Now if you look here, the value m is within single quote. That means this represents a character. So because the data member gender has been declared with the help of char data type. Okay, so for char data type we have to put a single value within quotation like this, and the value that I have put is m for this data member gender. Now as soon as this value m gets stored into this data member known as gender, some amount of memory spaces will be reserved for allocating this character value m into this data member gender. So how much memory space will be allocated into this data member called gender? that we can come to know from the data type of this data member. If you see here, the data type of this data member gender is char. Now since char occupies only 1 byte of memory space, so as soon as this value m gets stored into this data member gender, only 1 byte of memory space will be reserved for this data member. And this particular value that gets assigned into this data member known as gender also indicates a state of the object. So from here, the state of the object emp, okay, the state of the object emp has the gender value as m, which utilizes 1 byte of memory space. So once this is done, just come over here again. With the help of this object emp, I am trying to access the data member address. Now will I be able to access it? No. The compiler has again generated an error, because when I try to access this data member address, which is protected, the compiler restricted the access. You can see clearly here the data member address has been declared as protected. So just like how the private data members cannot be accessed from outside of the class, in the same way the protected data members can also not be accessed from outside of the class. That's why the object, when it tried to access this data member address, the compiler has generated an error message. It says the data member address is protected. However, in case if you create some subclasses or some child classes or descendant classes out of this parent class known as employee, in that case you can access these protected data members, and you won't be able to understand it now. Only if I start chapter number 6, inheritance, you will understand that in detail. So all these are about accessing the data members using the object emp. Now let me show you how you can access the member functions using the same object emp. Now look over here in this particular statement, using the object emp, this time I am trying to invoke or access the member function input codename. Now as it tried to do so, the compiler has generated an error. This is because the member function input codename is private. Okay, so you can see clearly here the member function input codename is private. Now as private members cannot be accessed from outside of this class, so from inside this main function, with the help of this object emp, you cannot access this private member function which is input codename. The compiler will generate an error. In the same way, using the same object emp, when it tried to access the member function input address, the compiler has again generated an error message. It says the member function input address is protected. So just as how the private member function cannot be accessed from outside of the class, in the same way the protected member function input address, okay, also it cannot be accessed from outside of the class. So this statement has generated an error because the member function input address is protected. Now again come over here, using the same object emp, I am trying to access the member function input details, but this time the compiler has not generated any error. This is because the member function input details is public. You can see clearly here the member function input details is public. Now since public members can be easily accessed from outside of the class, so outside of this class employee we have the main function, okay, and inside this main function with the help of this object emp, I was able to easily access the member function input details as it was public. Now I have to remove this statement return 0. This is because I have set the return type of the main function as void. So void means it's not going to return anything. As a result, the program stops here. Now all these steps are only for you to understand the logic. Okay, the program is going to stop in the second statement itself. Okay, as soon as the compiler detects an error in this statement, as the data member EMP code is private, the program is not going to proceed further. Okay, the program is going to halt immediately. It's not going to continue. Okay, all these steps I have mentioned only for you to understand. So to sum it up again, this is the class called employee with private, public and protected access specifiers having these data members and member functions. Now the function main is the point of inception of the program, so program execution always starts from the main function. At first it tried to create an object bearing the name EMP. Okay, after creating the object EMP, it binds the data members and the member functions to this object called EMP, and once it does that, it tries to access the data member EMP code using the object EMP, but at the same time the compiler generates an error because the data member EMP code is private. As private members cannot be accessed from outside of the class, so the program is going to halt immediately here. Okay, the compiler generates an error, it's going to stop immediately here, and it's not going to process the remaining statements, that is these statements. The program ends here after encountering an error. So just remember, if the access specifier is public, its members are accessible everywhere. If the access specifier is private, its members are accessible only inside the class. And if the access specifier is protected, its members are accessible inside the class and its subclasses or child classes, if it has. But that case will arise only if that particular class acts as a parent class. Okay, if it acts as a parent class, it is going to have some child classes or subclasses. Then only those subclasses or child classes can access these protected data members. Other than that, no other elements outside of that parent class shall be able to access these protected data members. No other elements. Now I hope this is clear. So that's all about the concept of access specifiers, private, public and protected. Now I want all of you to go through this video and understand the logic properly. Okay, if you don't understand, just replay the video again to clear the concept. And that's all for today. With this I end my presentation here.